For nearly 5 decades, Graceland stood frozen in time, honoring Elvis Presley.
A speculative mystery narrative. This script blends documented, real-world history. The 2020 Von Norseny Investments fraud case, Dr. George Nicopalos' real prescription scandal, the 1977 cemetery break-in, and decades of genuine Elvis sighting folklore, with an imagined, fictional narrative device, a locked Graceland attic and its contents. No such attic opening has actually occurred. This is a what-if storytelling frame built on real events. Every legend needs a locked door, and Graceland has one. Not a metaphorical one, an actual, physical staircase behind a velvet rope that 48 years of tour guides have pointed at and explained away with the same 4 words: "That's private, folks." Millions of visitors have walked beneath it. None of them have walked up it. And for a story this famous, that kind of silence doesn't stay quiet for long. It grows. It gathers rumors the way old houses gather dust, until the space behind that door becomes less a room and more a question mark hanging over one of the most visited homes in America. So let's ask it plainly. What if that door finally opened? What would be waiting on the other side of nearly 5 decades of silence? And would anyone actually want to know? Graceland wasn't always a mystery. In the spring of 1957, a 22-year-old Elvis Presley bought the property on the edge of Memphis for roughly $12,000, a price that felt enormous at the time and would be worth close to $1 million today. He kept the name the previous owners had given it. He didn't need to invent anything grander. The house already sounded like a place where a king would live. For the first 2 decades, Graceland was simply Elvis's world in miniature. Horses grazed the 14 acres. A chimpanzee named Scatter, dressed in tiny suits, wandered the grounds causing chaos at parties. There was a meditation garden Elvis built in 1964, all white columns and quiet fountains, a deliberate contrast to the noise of stardom. There was a jungle room with shag carpet climbing the walls, a basement television room built for watching 3 channels at once, and a racquetball building where, on the last night of his life, he sat down at a piano and played. Then came August 16, 1977, and Graceland stopped being a house that happened to be famous. It became something else entirely, part shrine, part fortress, part unanswered question. Elvis was 42 years old, and by his own account, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He'd fallen into the habit of staying awake for days at a stretch before crashing into an artificial, medicated sleep. On the afternoon of August 16th, his girlfriend Ginger Alden woke up around 2 and assumed he was still resting. By mid-afternoon, the quiet in the house had turned into something else. She knocked on the bathroom door. No answer. When she opened it, she found him on the floor. His road manager and close friend, Joe Esposito, ran upstairs and began CPR while paramedics were called. They worked on him the entire drive to Baptist Memorial Hospital. By 3:30 that afternoon, he was pronounced dead. That evening, medical examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco stood in front of reporters and delivered a short, tidy explanation. Cardiac arrhythmia. A heart that simply stopped. Natural causes, he said. And for a moment, that was the story the world was handed. But almost immediately, people who'd watched Elvis's decline up close knew there was more to it. He'd ballooned to nearly 260 pounds. His performances in his final year were inconsistent, some electric, some visibly labored, punctuated by forgotten lyrics and long, rambling stage talk. The autopsy, once its full contents leaked out, told a harder story: an enlarged heart, a swollen liver, and the kind of internal damage consistent with years of heavy prescription use. The toxicology report that followed showed a cocktail of powerful drugs in his system, painkillers, sedatives, and more, layered on top of each other. The obvious question became, who was writing all those prescriptions? The answer was George Nicopalos, known to almost everyone as Dr. Nick, who had been Elvis's personal physician since 1967. The numbers that came out afterward were staggering. In just the final 8 months of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick wrote prescriptions for more than 10,000 pills. The year before that wasn't much better, close to 19,000 pills in 1976 alone. When investigators later tallied it up, they found that in those last 8 months, Elvis had received nearly 200 separate prescriptions, an average of roughly 1 every day and a half. Dr. Nick's defense, when it finally came, was almost as unsettling as the numbers themselves. He pointed to real health problems, chronic pain from an old injury, glaucoma, a painful intestinal condition, and argued the medication was treatment, not indulgence. But his most striking claim was that he was, in his own mind, protecting Elvis. Better that he control and monitor the dosages, he argued, than have Elvis buying pills from someone with no oversight at all. It was managed harm, in his telling. Damage control, dressed up as care. Tennessee prosecutors weren't convinced. In 1980, Dr. Nick was charged with overprescribing, not just to Elvis but to other patients as well. A jury acquitted him. But the state medical board kept digging. And in 1995, 18 years after Elvis died, they revoked his license for good. Decades later, a new theory added another layer. In 2020, author Sally Hodel published a book arguing that Elvis may have carried an inherited condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, a disorder affecting the lungs and liver, along with a possibly compromised immune system. If she's right, some of what looked like reckless self-destruction might have actually been a body failing him for reasons no one in 1977 had the tools to diagnose. It doesn't erase the prescription numbers, but it complicates the easy narrative, addict versus victim, into something messier and more human. It's worth sitting with how strange Dr. Nick's role really was. He wasn't a stranger exploiting a celebrity for money. By most accounts, he genuinely cared about Elvis, traveled with him, and stayed close to the family for years afterward. That's arguably what makes the story more unsettling, not less. It wasn't a villain in a white coat cutting corners for profit. It was a trusted friend, making a series of judgment calls that, stacked one on top of another over a decade, added up to something none of them could have called a rescue. The system meant to protect Elvis, doctors, managers, family, kept choosing management over intervention, right up until there was nothing left to manage. Elvis's death didn't end the chaos. If anything, it triggered a new chapter of it. Nearly 100,000 fans converged on Memphis in the days that followed, lining the streets outside Graceland's gates. On August 18th, 17 white Cadillacs carried the funeral procession through the city, trailed by a guest list that read like a cultural time capsule. James Brown, Sammy Davis Jr., Caroline Kennedy, and a 9-year-old Lisa Marie Presley walking beside her grieving father, Vernon. Elvis was laid to rest beside his mother, Gladys, at Forest Hill Cemetery. It should have ended there. It didn't. Only 2 days after the funeral, a group of men attempted to break into the cemetery and steal Elvis's coffin. They failed, but they damaged part of the tomb before they were caught, a real, documented event that remains one of the stranger footnotes in the whole story. For Vernon Presley, it was the final straw. With the help of local police, he quietly had both his son and his wife reinterred, this time inside the walls of Graceland itself, in the meditation garden Elvis had built as his own private refuge. The site meant to offer him peace in life became the place meant to guard him in death. That decision changed the house permanently. Vernon added alarms. He hired round-the-clock security. And, according to the story that's been repeated by tour guides for generations, he sealed off the second floor and the attic above it, officially in the name of family privacy, though the official explanation has worn thinner with every passing year. When Graceland opened to the public in 1982, 5 years after Elvis's death, fans finally got to walk through the kitchen where he made his famous peanut butter and banana sandwiches, admire the stained glass in the living room, and stand at his grave in the garden. But the stairs to the second floor stayed roped off. The attic door stayed shut. Even visiting dignitaries, by most accounts, were never granted access. Ask a tour guide why, and for nearly half a century you get the same answer, almost word for word. It's private, out of respect for the family. It's a reasonable explanation. It's also, by design, an answer that closes the conversation rather than opening it, which is exactly the kind of silence that mythology loves to fill. And fill it, people did. Because while the attic sat locked and undiscussed, a much stranger story was unfolding just beyond Graceland's gates, one that insisted Elvis had never really left at all. The first sighting arrived almost immediately. Within hours of his death being announced, a man resembling Elvis, using the name John Burroughs, an alias Elvis had genuinely used while traveling, reportedly bought a one-way ticket out of Memphis. 2 weeks later, a woman in Kalamazoo, Michigan swore Elvis had served her at a Burger King, insisting she recognized his voice the moment he asked if she wanted extra cheese. The stories didn't fade. They multiplied. By 1979, Elvis had allegedly been spotted pumping gas in Oklahoma, shopping for groceries in Missouri, and slipping into a Nashville concert wearing a fake beard. The phenomenon became so widespread that in 1988, the tabloid Weekly World News launched a recurring feature literally called Elvis, Watch, just to keep pace with the claims. The theories kept evolving, too. Some insisted Elvis had gone into witness protection after helping the FBI target organized crime. Others believed he'd simply faked his death to escape the crushing weight of fame. A darker version of the rumor claimed he'd been secretly diagnosed with cancer and chose to die outside the public eye. Believers pointed to oddities around the funeral. A casket some claimed was suspiciously heavy, a closed casket burial after an open viewing, and most famously, a misspelling on his gravestone, where his middle name reads Aaron instead of the Aaron on his birth certificate. To conspiracy theorists, a mistake that glaring on a family memorial felt less like an error and more like a message. The internet only poured gasoline on it. Fan forums built entire archives trying to prove he was still alive. Amateur audio analysts compared his voice to a preacher named Bob Joyce, convinced the resemblance was too uncanny to be coincidence. Even now, in 2026, nearly half a century after his death, corners of the internet still argue about where he might be hiding, whether he's living quietly under another name or occasionally slipping back into Graceland itself, unrecognized, just to see the place one more time. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. The Elvis is a live myth, as fun as it is to entertain, has always functioned as a kind of escape hatch, a way to avoid sitting with the far sadder, far more preventable reality of how he actually died. A man surrounded by people who had every opportunity to say no and largely didn't. There's also a simpler, more human explanation for why the myth refuses to fade. People struggle to accept that someone so enormous, so permanently stitched into the culture, could vanish the way anyone else does. Grief resists endings. For a generation that grew up on his voice, the idea that he simply stopped existing on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Memphis felt too small for the size of what he meant to them. The sightings, in that light, aren't really about Elvis at all. They are about a public that wasn't ready to let go, dressing its grief up as a mystery because a mystery, unlike a death, can still have a different ending. If you thought Graceland's strangest chapter had already been written, 2024 proved otherwise. And this part isn't folklore. It's fully documented and a matter of public court record. That spring, a company almost no one had heard of, calling itself Norsany Investments and Private Lending LLC, filed paperwork attempting to force the sale of Graceland at public auction. According to the filing, Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter, who'd taken over management of the estate after her mother Lisa Marie Presley's death in 2023, had defaulted on a loan worth roughly $3.8 million, using Graceland itself as collateral. The news spread through Elvis's fan base like a shockwave. Keough's legal team moved fast, filing an emergency injunction in Shelby County, Tennessee, arguing the entire loan was fraudulent, that Keough had never signed the documents in question, and that her signature had been forged. With the auction date bearing down, a Tennessee judge intervened just one day before the scheduled sale, halting it outright and describing Graceland as an irreplaceable cultural landmark whose loss would harm the public. Tellingly, no representative from Norsany Investments ever appeared in court to contest the ruling. Graceland stayed exactly where it belonged. It was in the aftermath of that scare, genuinely rattled by how close the estate had come to slipping away, that Riley Keough is said to have decided it was finally time to open, catalog, and preserve whatever had been sitting untouched above the house for almost 50 years. Not necessarily to share it with the world, just to finally know what was there. This is where the documented history ends and the imagination is allowed to take over, because no one outside the Presley family and their archivists actually knows what sits behind that door. But it's worth sitting with the possibility for a moment, the way fans and historians have for decades. Picture it, not a hoard of gold records or rhinestone jumpsuits, since those are already on proud display downstairs, but something quieter. Boxes organized the way a man organizes his own life when he suspects, on some level, that someone will eventually go looking through it. A childhood toy patched together by a mother sewing scraps from her own worn dresses during the leanest years of his life. A well-read Bible from his years in the army, its spine held together with tape, its margins filled with notes only he would ever fully understand. A stack of half-finished song lyrics scratched onto hotel stationery, revealing the ordinary, unglamorous mess behind songs the world eventually heard is flawless. Maybe there are letters, too, the kind fans send by the thousands, some read and answered, others simply never opened, sealed the way they arrived, quietly outliving the man they were addressed to. None of that is confirmed. None of it should be reported as fact. But it's the shape of the story people want to be true, because it replaces the tabloid image of Elvis, bloated, medicated, mocked in his final years, with something closer to a full human being. Someone who kept his mother's Bible. Someone who was, underneath the sequins, still a kid from Tupelo who never quite stopped being afraid of losing everything. Maybe the attic holds nothing more dramatic than old furniture and Christmas decorations. Maybe it's exactly as boring as most attics are. Or maybe, some